Imagine standing in a dimly lit parlor in 17th century Massachusetts. The air is thick with the scent of rosemary and decay. In the corner, the family clock has been stopped at the exact minute of passing, and every mirror in the house is draped in heavy black cloth, not for decoration, but out of a genuine, spine-chilling fear that the deceased soul might get trapped in the reflection, doomed to haunt the glass forever. Outside, a family member is whispering to the beehives, informing the insects of their master's death, terrified that if they don't, the bees will die of grief or stop producing honey. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. This was everyday reality in colonial America. Welcome to a time when death was not hidden in hospitals, but was a public spectacle, an economic burden, and a ritualistic theater filled with superstitions that would keep you awake at night. The Parlor of Shadows. To understand the bizarre and often macabre nature of colonial mourning, one must first understand the intimacy of death in early America. In the year 1720, in the colonies of New England or Virginia, death was not a distant stranger. It was a constant, unwanted roommate. With mortality rates sky high, where nearly 1 in 4 children died before age 10, and epidemics like smallpox or yellow fever swept through towns with terrifying regularity, the colonists did not have the luxury of ignoring the Grim Reaper. Instead, they invited him in, sat him down, and built elaborate social customs around him. The journey began the moment the breath left the body. In modern times, a body is whisked away to a funeral home, sanitized and hidden from view until the service. But in the colonial era, the home was the center of the drama, specifically the parlor. Today, we might call it a living room, but historically, the best room in the house was often reserved for formal occasions, the most frequent of which was the laying out of the dead. This is actually why the term living room eventually became popular in the 20th century, to reclaim that space for the living rather than the dead. Upon the moment of death, a flurry of superstitious activity would erupt in the household. The first order of business was stopping the clock. It was widely believed that time stood still for the deceased, and allowing the clock to continue ticking was an invitation for bad luck, or worse, it might encourage the spirit to linger. If the head of the household died, the clock was stopped to mark the end of his time, and sometimes it wasn't started again until after the funeral. Simultaneously, the mirrors were covered. This practice, rooted in old British and European folklore, was taken very seriously in the colonies. The mirror was seen as a portal or a trap. If the soul, newly confused and separating from the body, were to catch a glimpse of itself in the looking glass, it might become ensnared, unable to pass on to the afterlife. For the Puritans of New England, who were obsessed with the destination of the soul, heaven or hell, the idea of a ghost trapped in a piece of furniture was a horrifying prospect. Once the spiritual protections were in place, the physical preparations began. There were no professional undertakers or funeral directors in the early 1700s. The task of washing and dressing the corpse fell to the women of the community, usually the family, neighbors, or local nurses who specialized in laying out the dead. They would wash the body with vinegar and alcohol, not just for cleanliness, but to delay putrefaction in an era before refrigeration. The body was then dressed in a shroud, often made of linen. Interestingly, due to a law passed in England, which affected the colonies, to support the paper industry, there were times when burying someone in linen was fined, as linen was needed for papermaking, so wool was mandated. However, the wealthy often paid the fine just to bury their loved ones in softer linen, making the very fabric of the grave a status symbol. But the most peculiar ritual happened outside in the garden. If the master of the house died, a family member had to go to the apiary. They would gently tap on the hives and whisper the news: "The master is dead." This was known as the telling the bees. It was believed that bees were messengers between worlds. If they weren't informed and treated with respect, sometimes even having their hives draped in tiny black crepe cloths, the bees would take offense, stop producing honey, or die alongside their master. While the bees were being informed in the garden, a different kind of buzz was generating inside the house, the gathering of the community for the watch. In the colonial era, a body was rarely left alone between the time of death and the burial. This practice, known as the wake, served practical and superstitious purposes. Practically, in an age where comas and swoons were sometimes mistaken for death, neighbors watched the body to ensure the deceased didn't suddenly wake up, a genuine fear known as taphophobia, or the fear of being buried alive. But culturally, the wake was a bizarre blend of solemn vigil and raucous social gathering. Contrary to the dour image of the Pilgrims and Puritans, colonial funerals were often awash in alcohol. It was considered a grave insult to the dead not to provide the mourners with copious amounts of drink. Funeral baked meats were served, but the real star was the liquor: rum, hard cider, and tankards of spiced beer. Records from the 1700s show that funeral costs were astronomical, not because of the coffin, but because of the booze. When a prominent minister died in Massachusetts in the mid-18th century, the funeral tab included dozens of gallons of wine and rum, enough to intoxicate the whole town. It was an expensive, boisterous send-off where the line between grieving and partying was frequently blurred. However, amidst the drinking and the storytelling, a darker, more obscure ritual would occasionally take place in the more remote or superstitious corners of the colonies, particularly in the Appalachian frontiers or areas with heavy Welsh influence. This was the arrival of the Sin Eater. The Sin Eater was usually a social pariah, a beggar or an impoverished soul living on the fringe of the village. The belief was that if a person died with unconfessed sins, their soul would wander the earth as a restless ghost. To prevent this, the family would hire a sin eater. The ritual was visceral and unsettling. A crust of bread and a bowl of beer or wine was passed over the corpse's chest, absorbing the sins of the deceased. Then the sin eater would consume the food and drink, effectively eating the sins and taking them upon his own soul, allowing the dead man to enter heaven spotless. The sin eater was paid a few coins and then immediately chased off the property, despised for the spiritual filth he now carried. While not universal, this practice highlights the desperate lengths colonists went to in ensuring spiritual safety. As the funeral day approached, the focus shifted to the funeral gloves and mourning rings. In a society obsessed with status, death was the ultimate status symbol. The family was expected to give gifts to the mourners. High-ranking guests, pallbearers, and the clergy were given high-quality leather gloves. A prominent minister might collect hundreds of pairs of gloves over a lifetime of officiating funerals, often selling them back to glove makers for extra income. Even more fascinating were the mourning rings. These were gold rings, often enameled in black or white for the unmarried or children, featuring macabre iconography, a skull, a skeleton, or a winged hourglass. Sometimes they even contained a lock of the deceased's hair woven under crystal. These weren't just trinkets, they were expensive commandments to the living. The inscription usually read Memento Mori, meaning remember you must die. The colonists wore these rings daily, a constant, heavy reminder on their finger that their own clock was ticking. The silent procession and the monkey spoon. When the eating, drinking, and gift-giving at the house concluded, the time came for the journey to the grave. In the modern American experience, we're accustomed to the motorcade, a line of cars with headlights on, following a sleek hearse. But in the colonial era, the journey was almost exclusively on foot, and it was a display of rigid social hierarchy. The coffin itself was usually a simple hexagonal toe-pincher shape made of pine or oak by a local cabinet maker. Because wood was plentiful but labor was not, these coffins were often unlined and rough. To mask the plainness of the wood, the coffin was covered with a pall, a heavy black velvet cloth. This gives us the term pall-bearer. In colonial funerals, there were actually two sets of carriers. The underbearers were young, strong men, sometimes indentured servants or slaves, who physically bore the weight of the coffin or on a bier. The pallbearers, by contrast, were honorary positions, reserved for older, distinguished community members. They walked alongside the coffin, merely holding the corners of the hem of the velvet pall. They carried no weight, but they carried the dignity of the procession. As the procession moved toward the burying ground, the term cemetery, meaning sleeping place, would not become popular until the mid-19th century rural cemetery movement. The atmosphere in Puritan New England was shockingly different from what we expect today. It was silent. The Puritans, who dominated the northern colonies, zealously avoided anything that smacked of Catholic ritual. They believed that once a person died, their soul's fate, heaven or hell, was already sealed by God. Prayers for the dead were considered useless and potentially blasphemous. Therefore, there were no graveside eulogies, no reading of ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and no prayers uttered as the coffin was lowered. The minister might walk with the family, but he remained silent at the pit. The only sound was the thud of dirt hitting the wood. It was a stark, cold transaction, returning the body to the earth without fanfare. The sermon, often a terrifying lecture on the fires of hell and the need for immediate repentance, would take place later at the meeting house, strictly for the benefit of the living. However, in the Dutch colonies like New York and the Anglican South, rituals were different and had their own eccentricities. In New York, a peculiar token known as the monkey spoon became popular. These were silver spoons given to pallbearers, the handles carved with a figure that was supposed to look like a human, but due to poor craftsmanship often resembled a monkey. These spoons were often hung on the pot rack in the recipient's kitchen, a macabre trophy of their participation in the burial. Once the body was in the ground, the problems were far from over. Colonial burying grounds were often disorganized and overcrowded. Grave markers were initially just wooden rails or field stones. It wasn't until later that the iconic slate headstones with their death's head iconography, a winged skull, appeared. These stones were not just markers, they were aggressive sermons in stone. They didn't say, "Rest in peace," they said, "Here lies the body," emphasizing that the person was gone. But nature presented the biggest challenge to the colonial burial. In the harsh winters of New England, the ground could freeze solid for feet. Digging a grave became impossible. This led to the necessity of the dead house or receiving tomb, a small cold stone structure built near the graveyard. If someone died in January, their body might be stored in the dead house, stacked alongside others, waiting for the spring thaw. It was a grim reality where the dead had to wait their turn to return to the earth, frozen in a state of suspended departure. The art of grief and the hair in the brooch. As the coffin was lowered and the earth filled in, the immediate crisis of death passed, but the long, structured theater of mourning began. Today, grief is often private, internal, and encouraged to move past quickly. In colonial America and moving into the Victorian era, grief was performative, public, and strictly codified. You didn't just feel sad, you wore your sadness. This was the era of mourning dress. The rules were particularly strict for women. A widow was expected to enter deep mourning immediately. For a year and a day, she was encased in dull black Parramatta silk or bombazine, fabrics that did not reflect light. Every shiny surface on her body had to be covered. Even her jewelry was restricted to jet, a fossilized coal that was matte black. She wore a weeping veil of heavy crepe that covered her face when she went out, shielding her tears from the public and shielding the public from the bad luck of seeing a widow's grief. This visual coding served a social purpose. In a tight-knit community, seeing a woman in full black was a signal: do not approach her with frivolous talk, do not court her, treat her with solemnity. It was a protective barrier. Over the next 2 years, she would transition to half-mourning, introducing shades of gray, purple or lavender into her wardrobe, signaling to the community that her heart was slowly healing and she might eventually be ready to re-enter society. Men, by contrast, had it easy. A simple black armband or a piece of black crepe on their hat sufficed, allowing them to continue business and remarriage with little interruption. But the most intimate, and to modern sensibilities perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this long mourning, was the obsession with hair. Photography did not exist for most of the colonial period. If a loved one died, you couldn't pull up a picture on a phone or look at a photo album. Once the coffin lid closed, you would never see their face again. The fear of forgetting the physical reality of a loved one was visceral. To combat this, colonists turned to hair work. Before the body was buried, a lock of hair was cut from the deceased. This hair wasn't just kept in a drawer, it was transformed into art. Hair does not decay like flesh, it remains the same color and texture for centuries. It was the only part of the person that survived death. Jewelers and specialized artists would weave this hair into intricate patterns. A widow might wear a brooch containing a weeping willow tree made entirely of her husband's hair. A mother might wear a locket with a tiny braided wreath made from the fine hair of a lost infant. This practice reached a fever pitch of complexity. Entire landscapes were created using crushed hair mixed with gum to paint sepia-toned scenes of tombs and urns. Large wreaths, sometimes 2 feet wide, were woven from the hair of multiple deceased family members, creating a literal family tree of the dead that hung in the parlor. While we might find this creepy today, for them it was a deeply sentimental act of preservation. It was a way to keep a piece of the beloved physically present in the world of the living, a tangible defiance against the total erasure of the grave. But as the 18th century gave way to the 19th, a new scientific curiosity began to clash with these sentimental rituals. The fear of the grave robber moved from Gothic fiction to American reality. Medical schools in budding cities like Philadelphia and New York needed bodies for dissection to teach anatomy. But legal bodies, usually executed criminals, were scarce. This demand birthed the resurrection men, grave snatchers who would sneak into graveyards under the cover of darkness, dig up the freshly buried, and sell them to doctors. The rise of the resurrection men introduced a new, very real terror to the grieving process. Imagine the horror of a family burying a child on Tuesday, only to find the grave disturbed and empty on Wednesday morning. This wasn't a supernatural haunting, it was a brutal economic transaction. The fear was so intense that it changed how cemeteries were guarded and how coffins were built. Families began to hire armed guards to watch over fresh graves for the first few weeks until decomposition rendered the body useless for anatomical study. In some wealthier graveyards, mort safes were installed. These were heavy iron cages or concrete slabs placed directly over the grave, locking the dead into the earth. It was a physical manifestation of the community's anxiety. They had to protect their dead, not from spirits, but from science. This anxiety dovetailed with the lingering fear of premature burial, sparking a wave of invention that borders on the comical if it weren't so morbid: the safety coffin. Patents flooded the U.S. Patent Office in the 18th and 19th centuries for devices designed to save those who woke up underground. The most famous design involved a string tied to the finger of the deceased. The string ran up through a tube in the coffin, out of the ground, and was attached to a bell mounted on the headstone. If the corpse twitched or woke up in a panic, the bell would ring, alerting the night watchman. Hence, the idioms "saved by the bell" and "dead ringer" are often popularly attributed to this practice. Though etymologists debate the true origins, the cultural connection remains strong. While these devices were rarely, if ever, successfully used to save a life, their existence proves how terrified the colonists were of the finality of the grave. They wanted an escape hatch.
As the colonies transitioned into a young nation, the rituals began to shift again. The strict Puritan avoidance of ceremony softened. The rural cemetery movement in the 1830s, starting with Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, changed the landscape of death forever. No longer were the dead crammed into dreary, chaotic town burying grounds. They were moved to park-like settings with winding paths, exotic trees, and beautiful sculptures. Death was being beautified. The harsh, "Here lies the body" headstones were replaced by softer sentiments like "Asleep in Jesus" or "Gone home." The skull and crossbones iconography was replaced by flowers, lambs, and angels. Death was no longer a terrifying punishment to be feared. It was reimagined as a gentle sleep, a temporary separation. This shift marked the end of the raw, visceral colonial way of death. The parlor, once the site of washing bodies, slowly became the living room. The undertaker became a professional funeral director, taking the body out of the home and into a sanitized facility. The intimacy was lost.
The wasting disease. To truly grasp the horror that gripped the colonies, specifically rural New England in the late 1700s, one must look beyond the black veils and stopped clocks to a specific, terrifying phenomenon, the Great Consumption. Today, we know it as tuberculosis, TB. But to a farmer in Rhode Island or Connecticut in 1780, it wasn't a bacterium, it was a slow, supernatural predation. The disease was horrific. It consumed the victim from the inside out. They became pale, their eyes sank, they coughed up blood, and they wasted away until they looked like walking corpses. But the strangest part was how it spread. It often wiped out entire families, one by one. First, the father would die. Then, weeks later, the eldest son would begin to pale and cough. Then the mother. To the superstitious colonists who did not understand germ theory, this didn't look like an infection. It looked like the first person who died was coming back from the grave to feed on their relatives. This belief sparked one of the most bizarre and morbid chapters in American history, the New England vampire panic. Long before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, American colonists were digging up their neighbors. This wasn't the cinematic vampire in a cape. This was a belief rooted in desperation and folklore. The ritual was grim and strictly followed. When a family member fell ill with consumption shortly after a relative had died of it, the community leaders and family would gather. They believed the deceased relative was undead and was draining the life force from the living family members through a spiritual connection. The solution was a nightmare. On a moonlit night, the men of the town would march to the graveyard with shovels. They would exhume the body of the suspected vampire. The goal was to check the condition of the corpse. If the body was found to be unusually well preserved, or if there was liquid blood in the heart, which is actually a natural part of decomposition in cold ground, though they didn't know that, it was taken as proof that the corpse was still alive and feeding. What followed was a ritual of exorcism that would make modern stomachs turn. The town doctor or a butcher would cut open the chest cavity. They would remove the heart and liver. These organs were then burned to ash on a nearby rock or in a blacksmith's forge. In some variations of the ritual, the ashes were mixed with water or medicine and given to the sick family member to drink. It was a macabre form of cannibalistic inoculation, eating the ancestor to stop them from eating you. One of the most famous early cases occurred in Jewett City, Connecticut. The Ray family was being decimated by consumption. By 1854, though the panic started much earlier, this case is the most well-documented example of the tradition. The patriarch, Henry Ray, had lost multiple sons. Desperate to save his remaining children, he and the townsfolk dug up 2 of his dead sons. They burned the bodies on the spot.
This wasn't done by cultists. These were church-going, God-fearing citizens who believed they were performing a necessary medical and spiritual procedure to stop a plague. This practice reveals a different side of colonial mourning. It wasn't just about sadness, it was about active defense. The dead were loved, yes, but they were also feared. The boundary between a beloved ancestor and a life-draining monster was thin, defined only by whether or not the rest of the family started coughing. Chapter 6. The Last Vampire of Exeter. While the vampire panic simmered throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, its most infamous chapter occurred surprisingly late, serving as the final dramatic gasp of this colonial superstition. This is the story of Mercy Brown, often called the last New England vampire. The events took place in Exeter, Rhode Island, a rural community where old traditions died hard, clashing violently with the modern world of 1892. The tragedy began in the household of George Brown, a stoic farmer who watched his family wither away one by one. First, his wife Mary died of consumption. Then, his eldest daughter, Mary Olive, succumbed to the same wasting disease. In 1892, his 19-year-old daughter, Mercy Lena Brown, also passed away. The family was shattered, but the horror was not over. George's son, Edwin, a young man with a bright future, began to show the terrifying symptoms: the hacking cough, the night sweats, the pale skin. He was dying. The neighbors, steeped in the folklore passed down from their Puritan ancestors, approached George with a grim theory. They believed one of the dead women, Mary, Mary Olive, or Mercy, was not truly dead. They whispered that one of them was sitting up in her grave, feasting on Edwin's tissue to sustain her unnatural life. George Brown was a practical man who didn't believe in vampires, but he was also a desperate father watching his last child die. Under immense pressure from the community, he gave permission for the graves to be opened. On a bleak, freezing morning on March 17, 1892, a group of men, including the local doctor, marched to Chestnut Hill Cemetery. They dug up the mother and the eldest daughter first. Both were mere skeletons, decomposing naturally. They were cleared of suspicion. Then they turned their shovels to Mercy Brown's grave. She had been buried only 2 months prior, during the dead of winter. When they pried the lid off her coffin, the men gasped. Mercy had shifted position. Her skin, though pale, appeared strangely fresh. There was no sign of significant decay, but the damning evidence came when the doctor, at the behest of the superstitious crowd, cut into her chest. He removed her heart and liver. To the horror of everyone present, the organs dripped with fresh, liquid blood. Today, science tells us this was simply because Mercy had been preserved by the freezing underground temperatures of the New England winter, essentially keeping her body in a refrigerator. But to the terrified townspeople of Exeter, this was undeniable proof. Mercy was a vampire. She was gorging herself on Edwin's blood. In a ritual that echoes the darkest medieval practices, they burned Mercy's heart and liver on a nearby rock or in a blacksmith's forge. In some variations of the ritual, the ashes were mixed with water or medicine and given to the sick family member to drink. It was a macabre form of cannibalistic inoculation, eating the ancestor to stop them from eating you.
A tonic. In a final, desperate attempt to break the curse, they fed this concoction to the dying Edwin. It was believed that consuming the vampire's heart would cure the victim. The tragedy is that it didn't work. Edwin died 2 months later. The ritual was a failure, but the story of the Exeter vampire exploded. It made headlines in newspapers as far away as London. It is widely believed that a clipping of this very story was found in the papers of Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula. It is chilling to think that the most famous horror novel in history may have been inspired not just by Transylvanian myths, but by the real, tangible grief of a Rhode Island farmer digging up his daughter in the snow.
The reaper's messenger and the biscuit of sorrow. While rural farmers were battling perceived vampires in the freezing woods of Rhode Island, the bustling colonial cities of Boston, Philadelphia, and New York were developing their own rigid, bureaucratic approach to death. In an era before telephones, obituaries in daily papers, or the internet, notifying a community of a death was a logistical nightmare. Enter one of the most ominous and specific professions of early America, the inviter to funerals. This was not a job for a casual volunteer. In Dutch New York, formerly New Amsterdam, and Puritan Boston, the inviter was a recognized municipal officer, often appointed by the mayor or town council. His appearance was designed to command silence and respect. Dressed in a long, flowing black cloak and a hat draped with a weeper, a long ribbon of black crepe that trailed down his back, he looked like a tangible shadow moving through the cobblestone streets. He carried a long staff, sometimes tipped with brass or silver, which he used to knock on doors. The ritual was severe. The inviter would strike the door with his staff, and when the resident answered, he would solemnly announce the death, the time of the funeral, and, crucially, whether the person was actually invited. Funerals were not always open to the public. They were carefully curated social events. To be snubbed by the inviter was a massive social slight, signaling that you had fallen out of favor with the deceased's family. The inviter was paid per head, meaning the more people he successfully summoned, the richer he became. It was a grim commission-based economy. Once the guests arrived at the funeral, they were greeted with one of the most peculiar culinary traditions of the time, the funeral biscuit. These were not soft, buttery dinner rolls. They were hard, dry cookies, often flavored with molasses, caraway seeds, or ginger, ingredients that preserved well. But these biscuits were not merely snacks to curb hunger during long sermons. They were edible tombstones. Bakers used special wooden molds to stamp the dough with macabre symbols before baking: winged cherubs, hourglasses, skulls, or crossed bones. The presentation of the funeral biscuit was just as important as the taste. They were individually wrapped in black wax paper or white paper sealed with black wax. The wrappers were often printed with crude woodcut illustrations of coffins and short rhyming poems known as mortuary verses. A typical wrapper might read, "When this you see, remember me. As I am now, so you must be." What makes this tradition truly strange to the modern observer is that people often didn't eat them. Because the biscuit represented the body of the deceased in a symbolic way, eating it felt disrespectful to some, while others kept them as souvenirs. In many colonial homes, you might find a shelf in the pantry or a glass cabinet displaying years' worth of funeral biscuits, rock hard and gathering dust, serving as a culinary museum of lost friends and relatives. To throw one away was considered bad luck. This practice had roots in European folklore, specifically the arval bread of England, but in the colonies it took on a life of its own. It became a way to monetize and package grief. As the colonies moved toward the Revolution, the funeral biscuit became a point of contention. The Continental Congress, in an effort to curb British imports and luxury spending, actually tried to ban the giving of elaborate funeral gifts like gloves and scarves. However, the humble biscuit survived the bans. It was a loophole in the austerity laws, a small permissible indulgence that allowed the colonists to continue their obsession with death rituals without breaking the law. The widow's year and the tyranny of crepe. As the colonies matured into the Victorian era, the rules surrounding death shifted from superstitious protection, like stopping clocks, to intense social performance. The burden of this performance fell almost entirely on women. While a widower could slap a black band on his arm and be remarried within a month without raising an eyebrow, a widow entered a prison of fabric and etiquette known as the Year of Weeds. Widow's weeds is a term derived from the Old English word wade, meaning garment, but in the 19th century American context, it meant one thing: crepe. This peculiar fabric was the undisputed dictator of mourning. Crepe, often spelled crepe today, is a crimped, gauzy silk that has been treated with heat and acid to give it a distinctive crinkled texture. It was matte, scratchy, and notoriously difficult to maintain. It stained easily in the rain, turned a rusty brown if exposed to too much sun, and the black dye often rubbed off on the skin, leaving the grieving widow with literal stains of sorrow on her neck and wrists. The first 12 months, deep mourning, a widow was a non-person in society. Her dress had to be covered entirely by crepe. It had to be high-necked, long-sleeved, and devoid of any shine. She could not wear velvet, satin, or lace, as those reflected light and suggested vanity. Her jewelry was stripped away, replaced only by dull jet or hair work. She was forbidden from attending parties, weddings, or any social gathering that involved joy. Her presence was considered a dampener, a living reminder of mortality that polite society wanted to keep at a distance. The weeping veil was the most striking component. Made of heavy crepe, it covered her entire head and face, falling to her knees. It was claustrophobic. Doctors of the time actually debated the health effects of crepe poisoning, believing that constantly breathing through the chemically treated, dye-saturated fabric caused respiratory issues and depression in widows. In a sense, the mourning clothes were physically sickening her, prolonging her grief by compromising her health. But the tyranny of mourning went beyond clothes. It dictated stationery. A widow had to use mourning stationery for all her correspondence. This paper had a thick black border. The width of the black border indicated how fresh the death was. In the first few months, the black border might be an inch wide, leaving only a tiny rectangle of white in the center for writing, a visual representation of how death was encroaching on her life. As the months passed and she entered half mourning, the border would shrink, eventually becoming a thin black line before disappearing altogether. It was a highly codified language. If you received a letter with a thick black border, you knew before opening it that the news was grim or the sender was in deep despair. It was the 19th century equivalent of a status update, but one that cost a fortune. The mourning industry was big business. Entire warehouses, like the Maison du Deuil in larger cities, sprang up to sell everything from black parasols to black-bordered handkerchiefs. They preyed on the fear of social judgment. If a widow didn't have the latest, most appropriate crepe, she was judged as not loving her husband enough. This commercialization of death reached absurd heights. There were mourning pins, mourning chocolate served at wakes, and even mourning dolls for children who had lost a sibling, dolls dressed in tiny black outfits so the child could play act the funeral. It was a culture where grief was not just an emotion, it was a consumption habit, a way of proving your moral worth through your purchasing power. The post-mortem portrait and the freeze of time. As the 19th century progressed, a new technology arrived that would collide spectacularly with American mourning culture: photography. In 1839, the daguerreotype was introduced. Suddenly, for the first time in human history, you could capture a perfect likeness of a person. But there was a problem. Photography was expensive and rare. Most families in the mid-1800s did not have casual snapshots of their children or their parents. You might go your entire life without having your picture taken. So, what happened when a child died? The parents were left with a terrifying realization: we have no image of him. As our memories fade, his face will disappear forever. This desperation birthed the genre of post-mortem photography, or as the Victorians gently called it, the last sleep.
Immediately after a death, sometimes even before the undertaker, the goal was to capture one final image of the loved one to serve as a keepsake.
But these were not photos of bodies in coffins, at least not initially. The parents wanted to remember the child as if they were alive. This led to elaborate and heartbreaking staging. The photographer would set up in the parlor. The dead child would be dressed in their Sunday best. They might be posed on a rocking horse or seated in a favorite chair. If the child's eyes were open, they might be left that way, or a skilled photographer would paint pupils onto the closed eyelids of the final print to simulate a gaze. In some photos, you can see a hidden mother. Because exposure times were long, a dead body was perfectly still, but a living baby was not. If a mother wanted a photo with her deceased infant, she might drape herself in a dark cloth and hold the body from behind, becoming a human chair hidden in the background, so the focus remained on the child. In other instances, specialized stands and clamps were used to prop up a stiffening adult body into a standing or seated position, creating an eerie illusion of life. To the modern eye, these photos, stiff, pale figures with painted eyes, propped up in unnatural poses, are the stuff of nightmares. We find them grotesque, but to the American family of 1860, this was an act of profound love. This 2-by-3-inch piece of silver-plated copper was the most valuable possession they owned. It was the only proof that their loved one had existed. As the Civil War erupted in 1861, this need for images exploded on a national scale. Soldiers were dying thousands of miles from home, their bodies often lost in mass graves or destroyed by cannon fire. The carte de visite, a small, cheap paper photograph, became the soldiers' connection to home. Soldiers would have their photos taken before marching off, leaving them with mothers and wives. Conversely, if a soldier died in a hospital, a photographer might snap a picture of his face to send home, confirming his death to a family who would never see his body. The sheer scale of death in the Civil War, over 600,000 men, broke the old colonial rituals. There was no time for inviting to funerals. There were no sin-eaters on the battlefield. The intricate mourning rules could not be maintained when half the country was in black. The war industrialized death. It necessitated the rapid advancement of embalming. Before the war, embalming was rare, but families in the North wanted their sons' bodies brought back from the southern battlefields. You couldn't ship a rotting corpse on a train for 3 days in the summer heat. Enter Dr. Thomas Holmes, the father of American embalming. He set up tents near the battlefields, charging families to pump the bodies full of arsenic and mercury solutions to preserve them for the journey home. This was the tipping point. The war killed the parlor funeral. Death became a medical procedure handled by professionals with chemicals, not by neighbors with vinegar. The undertaker became the mortician. The intimate, hands-on, superstitious rituals of the colonial past were being washed away by the chemical preservatives of the modern age. The train of mourning and the Lincoln effect. If the Civil War industrialized death, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1865 nationalized mourning. It was the moment that consolidated the shift from private, local rituals to a grand public spectacle that would define American grief for decades. When Lincoln died, his body wasn't just buried, it was paraded. A train funeral, dubbed the Lincoln Special, carried his embalmed body and the disinterred body of his son Willie on a winding 1,600-mile journey from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois. This wasn't just a transport mission, it was a traveling funeral that allowed millions of Americans to participate. But there was a gruesome logistical challenge. The journey took nearly 2 weeks in the spring warmth. Even with the best arsenic embalming of the time, the president's body began to decompose. The face that Americans lined up to see in New York City was not the same face that arrived in Chicago. Undertakers on the train had to constantly touch up the corpse with makeup and chalk to hide the darkening skin. It was a grim race against nature, played out on a national stage. This did two things. First, it popularized embalming. Before Lincoln, many Americans viewed the chemical preservation of bodies as mutilation or unchristian. But seeing the president preserved, at least well enough to be viewed for weeks, made the practice acceptable, even fashionable. It became the American way of death, preserving the body to look lifelike for the final viewing. Second, it cemented the color black as the permanent uniform of grief. Queen Victoria across the ocean had already started this trend, but Mary Todd Lincoln, the First Lady, took it to an obsessive level. She remained in deep mourning for the rest of her life, swathed in endless yards of expensive black crepe, spending thousands of dollars on mourning attire, even as she fell into debt. Her public display of shattered mental health and sartorial darkness influenced American widows for generations. Yet, as the 19th century drew to a close, a counter-movement began. The Gilded Age brought immense wealth to America, and with it a desire to sanitize death. The terrifying death's head gravestones were long gone. Now, cemeteries were becoming parks. The rural cemetery movement, exemplified by places like Greenwood in Brooklyn and Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, turned burial grounds into tourist destinations. People went there on Sundays for picnics. They strolled among the obelisks and mausoleums. Death was being romanticized. It was no longer the gritty, terrifying neighbor of the colonial era. It was the beautiful sleep. The rough pine coffins were replaced by velvet-lined caskets, a word that originally meant a jewelry box. The implication was clear. The body was a gem, precious and resting, not a decaying husk. However, in the shadows of this new, polite way of dying, remnants of the bizarre past lingered in the American South and Appalachia. In these isolated regions, where change came slowly, the old ways held on. Decoration Day, which would eventually become Memorial Day, started as a way to clean and decorate graves, but in the South, it was a major social event. Families would bring picnics into the graveyard, eating atop the flat tomb slabs of their ancestors. It was a literal communion with the dead, a direct descendant of the colonial funeral feasts. And in the deep hollers of the Smoky Mountains, you could still find elders who knew the telling of the bees, or who would cover a mirror when a storm rolled in, fearing that lightning was a spirit trying to enter the glass. The modernization of America could pave over the dirt roads, but it couldn't entirely pave over the superstitions buried in the soil. The spiritualist explosion and the Fox sisters. While the embalmers were preserving bodies, a new movement was claiming to preserve the voice of the dead. This was spiritualism, and it would become the final, wildest evolution of the colonial obsession with the afterlife. It didn't just invite death into the parlor, it invited ghosts to the dinner table. It started with a bang, literally. In 1848, in a small farmhouse in Hydesville, New York, two young sisters, Kate and Maggie Fox, claimed to hear mysterious rappings on the walls. They developed a code, 1 knock for yes, 2 for no. They claimed to be communicating with the spirit of a peddler who had been murdered in the house years earlier. The news spread like wildfire. In an America that was rapidly industrializing and losing its old religious certainties, the idea that you could scientifically prove life after death was intoxicating. The Fox sisters became celebrities. They launched a movement that by the post-Civil War era would claim millions of followers, including prominent figures like Mary Todd Lincoln and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The séance replaced the wake as the most exciting social event involving the dead. Instead of watching a silent corpse, people gathered in dark rooms, holding hands around a table, waiting for the medium to make contact. Trumpets floated in the air, tables tilted, and ghostly hands, made of cheesecloth and ectoplasm, materialized to touch the grieving sitters. This was the commodification of hope. Grieving mothers who had lost sons in the war paid handsomely to hear a message from the other side. It was a stark contrast to the Puritan ancestors who believed the dead were instantly gone to heaven or hell. Spiritualism suggested the dead were still here, hovering in the corner, desperate to chat. But it wasn't just about comfort, it was about entertainment. The medium was a performer. The cabinet, a curtained enclosure where the medium sat, was her stage. From this cabinet, spirits would emerge. Of course, this was rife with fraud. Ectoplasm was often just chewed paper or gauze regurgitated by the medium. The spirit voices were acts of ventriloquism.
Yet the hunger for it was real. It showed that the deep-seated fear of separation that drove the hair work and the post-mortem photography had simply found a new outlet. If you couldn't keep the body because of decomposition, and you couldn't keep the image because you had no photo, maybe you could keep the connection. This era also saw the rise of spiritualist photography. A photographer named William Mumler discovered that by double exposing a plate, he could create a ghostly, transparent figure standing behind a living subject. He sold these as genuine portraits of loved ones visiting from the afterlife. His most famous client was again Mary Todd Lincoln. Her photo shows her in mourning clothes with the translucent hands of Abraham Lincoln resting on her shoulders. It is a heartbreaking image of a woman exploited by her own grief, buying a lie because the truth that he was gone forever was too hard to bear. The spiritualist movement eventually collapsed under the weight of its own scandals. In 1888, Maggie Fox confessed that the original wrappings were made by cracking her toe joints against the wooden floorboards. But the movement had already changed America. It had loosened the grip of the strict church funeral and introduced the idea that death was a mystery to be explored, not just a fate to be accepted. The concrete vault and the end of intimacy. As the 20th century dawned, the final barrier between the living and the dead was erected. It wasn't spiritual, it was industrial. It was the burial vault. For centuries, the American way of burial was earth to earth. A wooden coffin was placed in the dirt and nature took its course. The body returned to the soil. But with the rise of the cemetery as a park concept, the lawn park cemetery movement, sinking graves became a problem. As a coffin collapsed and the body decomposed, the ground above would depress, ruining the perfectly manicured, flat green lawns that cemetery owners wanted to maintain for the mowers. To solve this landscaping problem, the concrete burial vault was introduced. This was a box for the box. The coffin was placed inside a sealed concrete or steel liner, which was then sealed shut. This prevented the ground from sinking, but it also fundamentally changed the philosophy of burial. We were no longer returning the body to the earth. We were putting it in a safety deposit box underground. We were hermetically sealing our loved ones away from the very nature that created them. It was the ultimate denial of decay. This shift coincided with the professionalization of the funeral industry. The funeral parlor moved out of the family home and into a business on Main Street. The funeral director took over every aspect of the process. The family no longer washed the body. They paid someone to do it behind closed doors. They no longer dug the grave. A machine did it. They no longer sat up all night for the wake in their own living room. They visited a carpeted viewing room with scheduled hours. We gained hygiene and convenience, but we lost intimacy. We handed our grief over to strangers. The raw, messy, beautiful, and terrifying rituals of the colonial past, the touching, the washing, the whispering to bees, the eating of sin, were sterilized out of existence. Yet history is circular. In recent years, there has been a resurgence in interest in green burials. People are rejecting the concrete vaults and the chemical embalming. They are asking to be buried in simple shrouds or pine boxes, in forests rather than golf course cemeteries. They are asking for home funerals, where the body stays in the house for a day or two. In a way, we are circling back to the colonial mindset, minus the superstition. We are realizing that perhaps those early Americans, with their strange customs, understood something we forgot, that death is not a medical failure to be hidden away, but a natural part of life to be faced, touched, and integrated into the community. The story of American mourning is a journey from the parlor to the funeral home, and perhaps slowly back again. It is a story of how we try to make sense of the silence that follows the last breath. And whether we use stopped clocks, black crepe, or digital memorials, the goal remains the same: to say, "I loved you, and I will not let you be forgotten." As we close this narrative journey through the strange landscape of American death, one thing becomes clear. Our ancestors were not morbid in the way we use the word today. They were practical. They lived in a world where death was as common as birth. They didn't have the luxury of denial. So they built a fortress of rituals. They created rules to navigate the chaos of loss. The monkey spoon wasn't just a weird trinket. It was a way to say, "We were here, we did our duty." The safety coffin wasn't just a gadget. It was a mechanical prayer for a second chance. The vampire panic wasn't just hysteria. It was a fierce, misguided attempt to protect the living family from a disease they couldn't see. These stories of bees and biscuits, of hair work and heart burning, are not just historical curiosities. They are the DNA of our own fears. When we feel a chill in a graveyard, or when we hesitate to delete the phone number of a friend who has passed, we are feeling the echo of the colonial heart. We are continuing the long human tradition of trying to speak to the silence. The colonial mourners have long since turned to dust, their slate markers leaning in the New England snow, but their message endures. Death is coming. Prepare your soul. But until it arrives, hold your loved ones close, and don't forget to tell the bees.